Well, it's another lovely evening, afternoon, or morning, depending where you are, for In Conservation with. I'm David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. Tonight, I'm speaking with Professor Frank Rennie. Now, Frank, Professor or Frank, by the way?
Frank's fine.
Good, because I like to make sure we have the etiquette right here. We're sponsored by Leica Sport Optics as well as CJ Wildlife. And CJ Wildlife are a team of passionate nature lovers and experts in garden wildlife on a mission to make nature accessible for everyone, whether you are a nature novice or garden guru. They want to inspire, educate, and provide the right tools to help nature thrive right on your doorstep. So that's them, and thank you very much for sponsoring us. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a bird that a lot of us may not have even seen, the corncrake. And tonight, we're talking to Frank Rennie. And where are you and how are you?
I'm first of all, I'm very well, thank you. I'm usually good, but sometimes I'm better. But right now, I'm very good. And I'm located. Well, I've got a slide later on to show you exactly if you think about it. But if you imagine the map of the UK, I'm up in the top left-hand corner, right in the very, very top left. So in the north of the Isle of Lewis and the northern Isle of the Outer Hebrides. So just the last stop before you come to Iceland.
Yeah, I've been to Lewis once, I think, or maybe twice, about 1,000 years ago, and I can't remember where I went actually. And I don't want to embarrass myself by trying to mention places because I'm sure. I mean, when Frank and I were having a chat, and a few days ago, I did mention somewhere, and he said, "Actually, no, that's Yorkneys." So I'm not going to embarrass myself. But for those who know, well, we need to know more about Frank. He is a professor of sustainable rural development at the University of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, where he lives and works, obviously, in the Outer Hebrides. He was initially a geologist. He pioneered the delivery of online education, primary in sustainable rural development subjects and digital literacy. His main research interests lie in digital educational approaches to make good science more accessible, which can never be a bad thing. He has been an advisor to several government bodies and is a fellow of 7 learned societies, 7 no less. He continues to supervise research students and has been involved in developing and delivering various combinations of distributed learning opportunities and open educational resources, particularly networking or networked digital solutions for rural areas with international partners. He has published a diverse range of resources related to the natural environment, social development, and cultural aspects of rural issues, including over 36 books and e-textbooks. And I must say, I only understood the last sentence of that because you obviously do a lot of stuff out there. I was also laughing because I made a mistake on your bio in my website. I called you Frankie.
All right. Only my Auntie May calls me Frankie.
Anyway, you are an awarded author already because you wrote a book called The Changing Outer Hebrides, Galson and the Meaning of Place. Can you just tell us about your accolade there?
Okay, so that book won the Highland Book Prize of 2020, which is quite a prestigious award for anything related to the Highlands and Islands or authors writing there or from or about that. And it also was shortlisted for the National Book Awards for Research Book of the Year. So I was quite pleased in that. And that really is a book about my own village. I live in a small village, a small crofting village in Lewis. And I wanted to look at the world through that village. So everything from the rocks that are some of the oldest rocks in the world, 3,000 million year old Lewisian gneiss, right through to the present day. Looking at the wildlife that moves through it, the birds that fly through, the human history, the glaciations that came and went, big world events, like the world wars and whatnot, but only in as much as how they influenced, or were influenced by my particular village. So it's really a sort of, a 3,000 million year love affair with a place, really. And it's been very well received. And just last week, I was commissioned to make a documentary film of it, which will eventually be going onto YouTube. A half-hour documentary looking at what makes a place special. So it's looking at the combination of things, whether it's wildlife or views or people or just a whole variety of different factors that make places special. And why is my special place different from your special place? What do they have in common or in different? So that's been quite fun in doing that.
Yeah.
So,
I must say, and this must be me being stupid, but I never understood the concept of somewhere having the oldest rocks in the world. You would have thought that the whole world was the same age. But anyway.
no. Well, I mean, you're still getting volcanoes producing new rocks even today. So obviously, there's going to be a huge difference.
Absolutely. And of course, this is your latest book. Just see if you can see it here.
Yep.
The corncrake, an ecology of an enigma. So we're going to discuss the corncrake. Now, the corncrake, interesting bird. I mean, I have not one picture of a corncrake, not even a blurred dot in the middle of a distance. This is the best I could do, which was or is an area of grassland in western Serbia. And I remember walking through this area and there was corncrake, 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 corncrake calling, quail, quail, quail. It was like being in paradise. And it reminded me, or not even reminded me, made me think that this must have been what Britain was like 200 years ago, perhaps. Because the agriculture, the farming here is not intense at all. They still use oxen and horses and stuff. So it's very, very primitive and slow. And there's lots of other birds around. And my personal history with corncrakes, I saw a moribund bird on Tresco in the Isles of Scilly. I remember going to twitch this thing, and we were all standing around a wall, and it was just half dead, leaning against a wall. I managed to see a few since then. I went to Iona and I saw some there, and I also glimpsed one or two, I think, in Eastern Europe, and I also found one on Tory Island once in Donegal in Ireland, and then that's me done. And I think I've seen more than most actually. You're going to be telling us about the corncrake, but firstly, let's hear about your interest in corncrakes. How did that start? And even before then, actually, how did you actually get involved in a natural history world?
I guess I always grew up in rural areas, so I've always been attracted to what's on around me, whether it's the birds or other wildlife. Very early on, I mean, like primary school, I got switched on to geology. And I went away to summer camp and came back with my suitcase full of rocks that my father could hardly lift. And yeah, I've always just been fascinated by the natural world. After university, after I finished my PhD, which was in geology on the granite geology of the mountain Loch Nagar, near Balmoral Estate, and I worked in that. And after I did that, I worked for a natural history resource centre for a year or so, and then worked some time for what was that time the Nature Conservancy Council, which was the Nature Protection Agency for UK. I was based in the Outer Hebrides, so I was basically, as they say, getting paid to eat sweets because, what's not to like about that? So that sort of broadened my horizons as well, more than just geology and landforms, into other forms of the natural world. Always been interested in birds, and that gave me a chance to go and do it, professionally for a while as well. So I did that. And I did that for a number of years, and then did some consultancy work, and then got involved in academia. And I've been that for quite a while now, for I guess about 30 years, I suppose we're doing that. So I've always been interested in that. And really the corncrake has been an early interest of mine. I mean, in living in a place like Lewis, like Outer Hebrides is really is the last stronghold in the UK of the corncrake. And so, these birds are really quite familiar around here in the summertime. Like if you're further south, you anticipate when you hear the cuckoo, and that's the first cuckoo of the year, and people prick up their ears and go, oh my, let's hear the cuckoo. Well, here we listen for the corncrake. And people get really quite passionate about their particular bird. Oh, the corncrake's back. Oh, did you hear? Oh, I heard one last week. You know, so it becomes really quite enthusiastic and quite affectionate, you know, relationship there. And so when the pandemic came along and I was working from home all the time as opposed to just part-time, because most of my work, as you said, is online and online teaching and online research, you know, communities and whatnot. But working from home all the time, you know, I saved almost a day a week just in commuting back and forward to the campus. And so I thought now is a good time to put some of that extra hours into good use for a personal project. And so I had lots of notebooks and, you know, 750 papers, basically, journal papers about the corncrake, not just here, because all over Europe, all over, you know, Asia, where it goes. And really began to piece the story together in a much more detailed way than I ever did before.
Okay, well, before we hear that story in terms of your presentation, I want to say that I forgot to tell you, I've actually held a corncrake, because I did a piece for BBC's The One Show. For those who don't know, it's a popular magazine format show in the evenings during the week. And I went to the Nene Valley where they were releasing some corncrakes. And I got to hold the baby chicks, little babies, they're black with long legs or dark. And then I remember going into a pen where they kept birds that were just about to release, and the pen was totally just all nettles and the birds were running around like rats. And we caught several of them, we weighed them. And I remember one of them, I was talking to the scientist working on them. I said, you know, how long do they live for? And he said, well, not too long. They live very fast and furious lives. And I said, well, let's call this one James Dean. And he said, we could do, but it's a female. So with that, let's get to see the actual truth in terms of what makes a corncrake.
So you want me to share the screen now, yes?
Yeah, and for those who are unfamiliar, when it comes to sharing screens, you need to watch using the speaker view function, which is to be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Instead of pressing gallery, go for the speaker view. So over to you, Frank.
Okay, so you see my opening slide there. Can you see that?
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the corncrake. I mean, it's basically slightly bigger than a chicken, a large chicken. And you're not alone, David, because for every one person that's seen a corncrake, there's probably 1,000 that haven't, but have heard them. And so their voice carries quite a long way, and it's quite distinctive. And I'll come to that in a minute or two later. But they're not particular. They're not striking birds. They're not like raptors, or they're not like sort of, you know, brightly coloured, you know, shell duck or something like that really grabs you with the colours. But they are quite special birds. They're quite iconic, and they've been associated with what they call extensive farming. So not intensive farming, low input, low output, very traditional styles of land management over the years. And what you've found, oops, why is my screen not moving on?
So
there we go. So the corncrake is quite a unique thing. So this is, you don't have to memorize this, but I mean, in terms of it, actually, its family tree, as it were, it's one of a kind. It really is one of a kind. It's not like some other birds, like you know Merlin. There are about 8 or 9 different subspecies of the bird, and many other things have local families and regional variations and whatnot. There's only one corncrake as it comes through, just one type as it goes through. Its nearest relation, in fact, is the African crake, and you can see that in here's Cracoropsis as it goes through there. So these are on a branch. They're very primitive birds. They go, you know, some of them go back. They're rails, so they're related to things like coots and so on and so forth. But they go back probably about 3 million years as it goes through, and it's tracing some of these birds. They're really quite difficult because the fossil record is quite thin on the evidence that goes through there, and they're known from bits of birds as it goes through there. But they're very, very specific animals as it goes through. This is where I'm based. So if you imagine the map of the world there, And then if you look at the top in the UK, that's there, that. And then in the top corner of that, you'll see there's the Outer Hebrides, and then up in the northwest corner. And then Lewis is that northern part, slightly further south even than that circle. And right on the edge of the northern part of that circle is where I stay. So literally right up in the top corner. And all down that coast, all down that, particularly the west coast, it's grassland areas, you'll find this is where corncrake are found. So you can see this is the recent, over the last sort of 30 years, I guess, as it goes through there. It's not much different from right now, from today, but you can see that the Inner Hebrides, which is just off the coast, the northwest coast of Scotland, and the Outer Hebrides, which are the outlying islands there, are the areas where the birds are most commonly found. I mean, last year there were only 825, I think, 824 found in the UK, and all of those in Scotland, breeding in Scotland. So the bird is continuing to decline in number. I'll come on to that in a second. But all of the areas you'll find breeding birds will be in the far north and the far west. This is the current indication of, you know, where the range of corncrakes are. So mostly down, and you see quite a lot of them are down in the southern Isles of the US there. That's that line of dark dots on the left-hand margin there. And that's because that's where all the big grasslands, what they call the Macher grasslands, these sandy plains of grass are found. And that's the environment the bird really likes, because it likes the grasslands. It likes grassland that's particularly not too dense, so it can make its way around, you know, at ground level and in between the vegetation, but tall enough to actually give it some cover over its head, so it gets some shelter from predators, from, you know, particularly aerial predators, and so it likes ideally grassland that's about knee height for us. Makes its way through and lives on the vegetation, the invertebrates and so on within that vegetation. This is the sort of terrain we're looking at, and you know, you can see these are small patchwork of fields. The crofting areas typically have small areas of grassland, cut grassland, permanent grassland, some grassland that we cut for hay, or more recent years for silage because of the unreliability of the weather, of getting long summer days to dry the hay. But also you have, you know, vegetation patches of things like potatoes and turnips and so on within that area. You'll be seeing areas of moorland and grassland, particularly areas of things like higher vegetation, irises and so on and so forth, that give it protection. And it moves around, the bird moves around from patches like in wildlife corridors in between all of these small fields. And so you really don't, one of the reasons that it's been really eradicated from England for a long time there is this move towards intensive farming and having bigger fields, mechanized cutting of grass and of grain and cereals and so on, which means that there's less space. So the bird has really been just driven out of the countryside. It's not because of any reason for not being able to survive there any longer. And if you look at this, this is from Ireland, but it could equally well be within England. The population drop hugely, and it took a long time for people to actually, the penny to drop and link the two things, because there were various suggestions as to why this was. Was it getting lost in migration? Was it the fact that we were being killed by cats and so on and so forth? But really, the thing that was driving the eradication of corncrake from most of UK and certainly all of England was the move from hand-cut grasslands with scythes and you know, rows of farm labourers going across there scything the grass, and the move towards agricultural machinery that cut at a faster pace. Initially, it was horse-drawn threshing machines that were mowing, reaping, and then of course when tractors came along, it got even faster and faster. And of course, quite often within these large fields, they would be cut in a spiral. So you would cut around the edge of the field first, and then get smaller and smaller and cut in towards the center of the field. And of course, the birds, if they hadn't flown yet, the chicks were just learning to fly, would be herded into the middle of the field there, and then would be mown down in the last few cuts, because they had nowhere else to run, they'd nowhere else to hide. And if you plot the last time that corncrakes were seen, and you start off from the south coast of England and mark down, you can almost sort of mark like isobars marching up the country, as you see more and more land further and further north became mechanized cutting machines as it goes through there. Oops, go back to that one there. So this is a thing. This is obviously being cut by, this is grass that's cut for silage. This is just in my own village here. And that sort of grass you've been loving, this has been cut and now been turned to dry. But you can imagine that in that field there, that small field, that'd be ideal. And corncrakes down the bottom of this field some years. Lovely area for this, lovely habitat for this. But you can imagine if you're cutting in an inward cutting spiral, you're going to drive the birds into the center, and they were just getting chopped up by the blades and massacred. So the recommendation is nowadays that people are actually, if you're going to cut this, you start in the center of the field and you cut out the way, and that way you drive the birds, if they are there, you drive them out into the increasing margins, and the field margins are much more safe for the bird. They can move to other fields, they can jump the fence and jump the wall into the next field, and then come back once the grass has been cut and breed on the invertebrates there as well. So that's the sort of environment you're looking at for it as it goes through. The global distribution of corncrake is really quite interesting, because we are sort of conditioned in the UK to think about this being a particular problem bird, because its numbers are going down and down and down every year. There's been a huge drop even since 2014 was the high point of the recent years. There was about 1,200 birds or so in about then. And so we're considerably less even now, half a dozen years later. But corncrakes are actually found all through Europe and right across into Eastern Europe and into Russia, even as far as the sort of the western edges of China and the Far East there. And although sometimes people are talking about the imminent demise of corncrake in this country and talking about its extinction, they mean the extinction in the UK, because although there are small numbers in much of Western Europe, in France and Germany and so on, because of the same environmental conditions as there are within the UK, and the cutting of the grass too early and killing the birds that way. When you go into the more traditional agricultural areas of Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia and so forth, they're much more common. And it was really interesting. At one point, not like 20 odd years ago, I guess, nearly 30 years ago now, the bird was on the Red Book vulnerable status. But with the collapse of the Cold War, when people started speaking to each other in scientific terms again and sort of sharing information, we discovered between 1 and 1.5 million pairs in European Russia alone. Another 500,000 to 1 million further in Asiatic Russia. So they reckon there's about a population of about 6 million birds globally these days. So they're quite strong in other areas, but just because of the agricultural conditions within the UK and Ireland and France, to a large extent, Netherlands and so on, then they're likely to be losing numbers continually from that country. They're not really found south of the Pyrenees. They migrate across to southern Africa for the non-breeding season, and so they have two main routes. They go across the Strait of Gibraltar there, and they go across through Lebanon, Israel, down through Egypt and so on, down that way. Most of them do not try to cross the Mediterranean, as it seems. And for, many years, historically, in the 1900s and so on, in the 1800s certainly, there was a great mystery of where these birds went. They just disappeared, and then we would hear them again in the spring. They would, because they're noisy birds. The concrete will normally call between 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, quite often do 10,000 calls per night. And so there are hundreds of thousands of calls over a summer breeding season. So they really make their presence felt on the landscape. I'll let you hear the call in a minute or two, but they really make their presence felt. But after they're finished breeding, they disappear. And so there were all sorts of folk tales about them hiding out in walls and hiding underground and living in rabbits' burrows and whatnot as well, because people just couldn't, before the advent of scientific investigation to these things, people just couldn't believe that these small, dumpy birds with really short wings could manage to fly anywhere, could manage to migrate. But most of them, whether they're going to be in eastern China or whether they're in large expanse of the European countries, most of them actually head for this area of northern South Africa and Mozambique, that sort of area over there. And they spend what is our winter there. I think I resist the temptation to say that they winter in Africa, because actually they're getting 2 summers. It's only us that stay for the winter. They're getting a summer here, and then they go for a summer in Africa, then they come back for the summer here. And so these birds actually are quite quiet out with their breeding season. So although they're noisy and make their presence felt in the landscape during the breeding season, when they go to migrate, they're very, very quiet. They're solitary, and we'll see in a second or two, they're found more or less all over Africa to some extent. There was some birds ringed in the islands of Scotland that turned up in clearings in the Congo and were radio tracked there and back. So we know this for a fact. So you can see there, these are sort of individual dots. These are where concrete have been recovered in the non-breeding season. Wild dots all over Africa. So the majority of them are in the south and east of Africa, but they are scattered in almost every other country. And you can imagine that record is hugely incomplete, because the chances of actually somebody being in the right place, David and I were just discussing before we came online about being in the right place at the right time to see things as they pop up. If you're 5 minutes early, 5 minutes later, you miss it. Well, imagine that in the huge expanse of Africa. If you're not in the right place and you don't see the concrete landing, it's quiet, it's secretive, it's hiding. It comes through, you don't see it. If you do see it, you don't know what it is. If you don't know what it is, you don't know who to report it to. So most of them, I would say, are unrecorded. And so unless we actually radio tag the birds, there's very little idea of finding out where they've been, because even if you found a ringed bird, who do you return it to? How do you know it's worth reporting? So if you're looking at the movements of concrete, you can actually trace them as it goes through there. And so if you follow coming down from the north, it's like a wave almost. They pass through in the end of the summer, of our summer. In August, September, they leave. They go down through the European countries, down through into Egypt, and down through Somalia, down through East Africa. Huge numbers caught in nets in Sinai and in Egypt as they go through there. Quite often they're traveling with large flocks of quail, and people are trying to trap the quail, and the concrete get caught in their nests as well. Large numbers been lost there, but probably not significant to affect the overall global population. So it's not a major threat to them. It's obviously, it'd be better if that didn't happen, but it's not a huge overall threat to it. But you can see as it goes through there, they move down through Egypt, and then down through into Kenya, down through the southern parts into Zambia and so on, back out again, and spend the day there until it gets to the rainy season. And the rainy season starts, they then move back, and they come back quite frequently to areas quite close to where they were brought up. Not necessarily they're not necessarily as faithful to breeding sites as some birds like curlew. Curlew will migrate and then come back and nest in an area almost in the same tuft of grass in the same corner of the same field as they did last year. So corncrake are not quite as faithful as that, but they'll come up to the general areas. So when people say, oh, I've been listening to that bird for the last half a dozen years, well, probably not, but it's probably going to be the son of that bird that you listen to. Because the curious fact is that, you know, they don't live very long. They'll only live in general 3 or 4 years. They have small numbers of chicks that they rear, and it's only the male bird that calls. The characteristic call that we hear is one of the few birds that's named after its call. It's called crex in Latin, because it gives this crex. And so it's a very distinctive call. The female does make a call, but it's a much more whimpering sound, really, that links up with to give warning or to give support to its nestlings, to its chicks. It does not have that strident, hoarse signaling call that the bird is well known for. So these are all photographs from my good friend John Love. John Love was the person who introduced the sea eagle to Scotland again from Norway. John Love lives in Uist, and he has corncrakes that he can virtually photograph out of his kitchen window because they're right in the grasslands all around him. So some of my photographs were just smudges on the horizon, but John has given me some of these photographs for the book. And these are some of the ones that are in the show. So this is a male and a female. The male at the back there stretching its neck and calling crex. And the female, much about the same size, slightly smaller, but not so you would notice a difference in the field. You notice it in the hand. Mostly you would recognize them by the brood patch that the female would have when it's sitting on the eggs. But the male has this classic call. The male will often prepare a couple of nest sites and try to attract the birds to it, and try to attract a female to it, and will quite often go a few yards away to a high point, and will then call with its traditional crex call, as I say earlier, from 11 o'clock at night or late at night into the early hours of the morning, 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning. And the call itself is a combination of two things. It's a combination of announcing its presence to other males to keep back, keep out, but also a coded signal for females that they're available, ready for breeding as it goes through. And there's some, one of the fascinating things about finding the book there is get into all the research data. There's a lot of study that can show that we still don't understand really the full functionality of the calls that the corncrake make. But there is evidence to see that the corncrake's call is more aggressive, more belligerent when it hears an echoing call from another bird that's a stranger. They tend to be less frenetic, less strident, making the calls when it hears a bird that's one of its regular neighbours within the area. So quite often on a calm summer evening in this part of the world, you'll hear multiple corncrakes calling. As David was saying at the start, you'll hear them as you walk through the landscape ping-ponging back and forward from each other. One bird will call, the other will call back again to say, I'm over here, don't worry about me, but I'm here. And the other one will call back, no, this is my patch. It's, I'm over here. And so there's like an echo to itself, but these are, different birds calling each other. The bird call itself, I'll show you in a minute here, is quite individual and quite distinct, and that's quite fascinating. And that was one of the things that I discovered that was new for me about the study. The sex differences are quite difficult to pin down because the birds have the same sort of plumage and more or less the same sort of size. You really have to catch the birds and measure them really to be sure to identify. And it's a combination of the total length of the bird versus the chord length, the wing length of the bird. And you can see that above the line, you've got the open circles that are the males, and then the black dots are the female. So there's a clear division of the pattern on the proportion of the sizes of the bird. But when you see it out in the field, running with its head down in between the grass, all you'll see is a little brown dash, a little dot that disappears between your ears again and reappears somewhere else. If you wait long enough, they'll start calling again, the male. But like as not, you won't really see the bird. Most people will hear the bird but never actually see it. So it's quite unique to try and spot the differences as it goes through. They do have 2 broods, but again, this is something that is only relatively recently discovered. People thought they just bred once and that was it. Corncrakes are seriously promiscuous, so they are one mate at a time. But after the first clutch has been laid, the male usually takes off and tries to find another partner. It might move just a few hundred meters, or it might move tens of kilometers to other sites, whereas the female remains with the nest and tries to raise the chicks, to hatch the eggs. Once the eggs have been hatched, the chicks will stay with the mother for a few days, but not for long. And then the mother herself, if it's a good season and there's enough food and so on, will try and find another partner as well. So they may breed twice within the one season to different partners. And that's only relatively recently been seen. And you can see within this, there's a slight shift. As we go further south, they breed earlier. So there'll be a peak in May and another one in July as it goes through there. If you're going back to Scotland, it's much more late. We're looking at June really for the first batch of chicks coming out, and then another one maybe late July coming through there, just because we're further north, and the birds take longer to get from Africa to here. But of course, in our part of the world, in the far far north here, we have I certainly have 24 hours daylight in the middle of the summer, so it's continual daylight. So the birds will be breeding and feeding all 24 hours, all night long. And there's the chick you would have had in your hand, David. It's a little bundle of fluff, really. It's just like a sort of a ball of wool with 2 sticks in it. They're not much bigger than the size of a man's fist when it comes out there. Not particularly attractive, but neither are they gratuitously ugly. But they'll go through there. But these ones, so you'll probably get 4 or 5 or 6 eggs hatching through there and sticking closely with the mother. They will migrate early on. The second clutch, when they have a second clutch, may well stick with the mother for a week or so, and then the whole lot, when the chicks are able to fly, adults and chicks will both almost simultaneously leave the area and fly down for its migration. So we're looking at, you wonder how a small thing like that can actually fly those huge, colossal distances. But they just do it in stages. They make their way down, hop, and as we see there, some of them have obviously arrived in some part of West Africa or Central Africa and just thought, yeah, I'm not going to go any further. I'm just going to stay here. What's the point? They've found enough food, enough shelter. They'll stay there, and then they'll fly back at the start of the rainy season to come back to the northern habitats. Birds that we might see late in the season, or hear calling late in the season, are probably not ones that are arriving back from Africa at that stage. They're probably ones that have bred somewhere else. And either have been successful and they're moving on for a second clutch, or they have been unsuccessful and they're going to try again to raise chicks in another area. So quite often, for example, you'll see in Austria, in Switzerland, you'll see birds that come and try to nest initially in the grasslands of the farming areas in the south, below the Alps. But because it's so heavily intensified agriculture there, they're unsuccessful, and then they'll move to the higher pastures later in the season to try and breed in the grasslands, because the grassland, of course, the crops is behind time, and because it's higher and colder in the year, and so the grass crop will grow later than it will be down in the warmer, flatter areas further south. So you'll get the chicks, the birds moving in there to the alpine areas later on in the season, but that's probably trying to raise a second clutch or raise a first clutch, a first successful clutch in the higher alpine meadow pastures. This is one of the reasons why modern conservation methods try to discourage farmers and crofters from cutting all the grass at the same time, because if it's all cut at the same time, the birds have got nowhere else to go. Whereas if you cut it in sort of, a day or two afterwards, or even a week or two afterwards in different areas, the birds can move around the countryside from taking shelter in the areas that still have long grass remaining after other bits have been cut. And then they can, by that time, the last grass has been cut, they can move back into the shelter of nettles or iris beds and so on as it goes through in the growing season. Again, trying to identify, they are a bird of lots of uncertainty as it goes through. So trying to identify the age of chicks as they go through there is really quite difficult. And the only real effective way of doing it is to catch them and to look at the weight gain they have. And you can more or less match that graphically with the age, the number of days that it goes through there. So it takes them a couple of months from hatching through to full fledging and being able to get enough strength in their wings to go away and fly. So they more or less put on weight quite rapidly and then level off as it goes through there. So certainly in the first 20 days, you can more or less have a straight line graph and mark off the weight of the chick nestling with the age as it goes through there. But because they're so similar and because they're just a small bundle of fluff, basically it's really quite hard. And you can't really do it with binoculars from a distance. It really takes that sort of expert hands-on advice to go through. Another way of doing it is to look at the wing length and compare that with that. So the little waxy bit at the bottom of the wings, where it sticks into the bird's body, comparing the length of the wax with the wing itself, you can more or less again do a straight line graph and compare that with the age and days as it goes through, as the wings, as the feathers begin to grow and begin to extend and build up the plumage. So these are quite technical, quite difficult decisions that you make through, unlike some birds that just go through. So let me move on to the call, because this is the thing that's going to be most familiar to many people. As I said earlier on, it's the male that calls. And so the common way of actually counting concretes in the field is to walk around and listen to where you hear that crex call. In fact, you can play a recording, on your phone or on a digital player, as you walk around the fields in the late evening, and the concrete will immediately respond to it. Will start calling back. It thinks there's another concrete there, and it's saying, "Clear off. This is my patch. This is my bit." It will start to respond to you. So you can then count that bird, note where it is, and carry on your walk, and then find another one in another field, half a mile or so down the road as it goes through. So quite a distinctive call, this rough crex stuff. However, the really surprising thing, and this is something I brought out in the book there, is although the concrete crex call sounds identical to us from one bird to the next, to the human ear, when you actually record this and analyze it, it's quite different. They're quite separate. I want to try and play a couple of things to you. Hopefully you can hear it on the screen here. I'll play you two different concrete calls and you'll see the difference yourself. This is the first one. I'll do it again.
We're not hearing it actually.
Nope.
Is it part of the actual presentation?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay, we're not hearing it at all.
Oh, that's a pity. Okay. I was playing it on my phone there.
Well, I got this.
Yep. That is more or less just what I did. I don't know why you didn't hear it from here, but maybe it wasn't close enough to the Let me try that again. Did you hear that one?
I heard something a second ago. Can you hear it? Is your volume up?
Yeah. It's blasting out. Don't know why you don't hear it. Anyway, the point from this, and it doesn't really matter. You can do that if you go into any of the sound archive repositories, Canto, or any of these things. There, you'll find a whole variety of different corncrake calls. The point I wanted to make was each corncrake call is slightly different. So the creks syllable, the length of the creks, and the time between that first crek and the second crek, and the time between that pair of creks, the creks, and the next creks, is the time interval is different for every single bird. So you can listen to this, and if you record the bird and play it through, a sonograph, software, you can actually get a pattern like this that shows you the calling, the time signature of the bird as it goes through. And so you can actually, when you hear that, you can match that with the bird you heard and that fooled across that way last night and say, yeah, that's the same bird. It's got exactly the same time signature. Whereas a different bird would have a slightly different space between the call and the call between the creks and the next creks as it goes through. So it's quite a stunning difference as it goes through. You would never have thought of that if you go through there, because, as I say, to our ears, they sound identical as it goes through. So they like, as I said earlier on, they like this tall grass. Even when they go to Africa, they'll be living in taller grasslands as well, different grass species that we have here, but the same basic principle. It's loose and open at ground level, so they can move away, they can weave their way through that, they can find their way through, they can find invertebrates, they can lead their chicks from safety to safety as it goes through there. But the grass, being about knee height, just covers over their head and actually shields them from sight from above, from humans or from raptors, for example, going through throughout the season. And quite often when they arrive back in Scotland from their migration from Africa, this is where they'll go first. They'll go into the tall iris, the yellow iris, the flag iris clumps in areas of wetland, because this gives you, as you can see, this is a tall shelter, gives them that. They can hide in there because it's in the start of the year in April. When they come back, the grass is only starting to grow, really. It's not into its full summer growth yet, so it's not big enough to hide them. So they will be into the iris, they'll be into patches of nettle, they'll be into tall grass that is grown along the edge of field boundaries and against walls and so on and so forth. It's not been cut back so intensively as the main grass crop was at the end of the previous year. In terms of the habitats they're doing, they like mainly meadows and pasture, but they will also be found on arable land. Quite often there's a particular group in Poland that likes to nest in the huge potato fields there for the same reason. They can move around under the leaves along ground level, but still get shelter. They tend not to be around areas of shrubland or forest land and whatnot. So with the collapse of Soviet Russia, Soviet regime there at the end of the Cold War, there were many thousands of hectares that were abandoned. And initially of agricultural land that was abandoned because it wasn't profitable any longer with the end of collective farming. And so a large number of those farms provide ideal habitat for corncrakes, and so there was a good boost of corncrakes there. As time goes on, And as that grass becomes ranker and coarser and tougher, and as the shrubs come in and begin to go into trees, it becomes less suitable. So it's one of these strange, it's a very narrow window of opportunity for the corncrake for ideal habitat. It doesn't like intensive farmland, nor does it like abandoned farmland, because it's too rank and too tough. So that area where it's managed farmland, but managed and cut later on in the season, usually here mid-August onwards, gives the birds time to hatch their eggs, raise their chicks to fledgling, and get them to be able to fly, at least clumsily, out of the way of farm machinery and farm tractors as it goes through. So this is us, this is me, in fact, on one of the local reserves. And what we're doing is this grassland, their corncrake is a corncrake literally just at that nests regularly just on the right of the screen here. It likes this tall grassland, moist grassland, not marshy. It's wet ground, but it's not swamp ground. It's not standing water. Unlike the African crake that can stand a bit more damp ground underfoot. But what we're doing here is clearing patches of ground to give them that area of mixed habitat with a variety of invertebrates that they can live on, and yet there's plenty of cover here to sneak back into the tall grass and escape and hide. And there's just off screen to the right here, there's a bird hide. And you can sit in that hide, and literally it's just within about, maybe about 10 and 12 meters from you, 10 and 12 paces from you. There's a corncrake that'll be hiding in the garden. And most times I would say, 100 times, 99 times out of 100, people will come down to that hide and hear the corncrake and leave without seeing them. So it's a very elusive species. This is another trick we do. We'll plant irises in some of the wet areas. This is iris right in the bottom of the screen here, to try and actually grow these things and give clumps so they can move around and jump around the landscape rather than looking at the bare grasslands area as it goes through. So this is the book I've done, produced from Whittle's Publishers, Corncrake, the College of Enigma, and it's you find it in Waterson's and all the other bookshops and whatnot, and Amazon and whatnot as it goes through there. So more than happy to have any particular questions, or I don't know where if that's stimulated any questions for you, David, or how do you want to take it from there?
Well, firstly, we stopped sharing, and secondly, I tell you that was incredible. I learned so much in the last period of time about corncrakes. I didn't know much before, but I know a hell of a lot more, and I have a ton of questions, I must say. But we've only got about 5 minutes before we say goodbye. And that's why you need to be a member of the Urban Bird of World community, because then if you're watching this in the future, you'll be able to see all the questions that have come up after the end of this particular broadcast. But no, it's been fascinating to learn about it. And I noticed one question was, I noticed that you say that the birds, I suppose in Western Europe, travel through the Straits of Gibraltar into Africa. How come we don't see any? I mean, do they fly completely from A to B? Do they sort of stop off and have a little sneaky rest somewhere before moving on?
One of the things, again, one of the things that came up while I was doing the background research for the book was, it's only relatively recently, I don't know if you've heard of NOCMIG, nocturnal migration, basically people sticking a microphone out in the garden, going to sleep and waking up in the morning and then listen to the recording on fast forward. We've discovered corncrakes calling all the way through that area, from all the way down through England. You'll get corncrakes passing through Manchester or whatever else it is, or through Cardiff as they head south. And because they arrive in darkness and leave in darkness, and in fact, you don't actually see them at all, but they are passing through as it goes through there. So, I mean, they're hard enough to find in their breeding habitat. So the chance of you being in the right place at the right time on the southern fly path is extremely unlikely.
But they do stop to rest, I take it.
They do stop.
But we don't know where. We just know they stop. Okay, fair enough. Okay, listen, we're going to have all the questions in the Q&A, I think, because otherwise we're going to be running over the hour-long conversation that we normally have. Um, the first question I need to ask you is, if you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
I would have to say here. I mean, this is like the Serengeti for me. This is the place there. There are only two places in the world, unlike that I like. I wouldn't say more, but close seconds. One would be South Island in New Zealand, which is very like this part of the world in northern Scotland. And the other place is in the Himalaya with Bhutan. I've been to Bhutan many times with work with the university, and it's such a unique culture, a unique environment, and some of the birding there is exceptional because they're Buddhists, they don't hunt, they don't eat them, and so you can get very very close to some birds, and they're just not scared of human company. So if it wasn't going to be in the sort of the Western Highlands of Scotland, I'd have to say southern New Zealand or else in Bhutan. And I'd happily spend time in any of them.
Yeah, I'd love to go all three places personally. And dare I ask you, is this an obvious question, but have you a favorite bird? And if so, uh, what is it?
Well, my favorite bird at the moment is the merlin. Merlins are very, very complex. I'm working on some stuff just now on merlins. I'm part of the Lewis and Harris Raptor study group, but merlins are relatively common here, but they are very difficult birds to study. But they are so complex. There's 9 different subspecies, and you get people who say they only nest on the ground, or they only nest in crow's nests, or they only do this, or they only do that. And actually, in fact, they're extremely versatile, and following that unraveling that complex behavior is almost, it's becoming a lot obsessional. So I would say right now, merlin is probably my favorite bird.
And it sounds like we're going to have you on again to talk about the Merlin in future,
Merlins.
no doubt. Okay, Zoomers, just to let you know, there's one more in conservation with for 2022, and that's next Monday with a guy called Connor Jameson, and he'll be talking about the life of the naturalist W.H. Hudson. Really fascinating guy. As far as I'm concerned, the original urban birder. And then we start up again in January, on the 9th of January, and there's a ton of people coming up. Talking about subjects ranging from a big year. We talked to the guy that holds the current record, and he'll be telling us about his big year around the world, checking out all the birds he can find. We'll be talking to a woman called Dr. Karen Backer, and she's going to be talking about the sounds of life. She's interested in the sounds that wildlife makes, and also talking about digital technology, and does that bring us closer to nature. We've got loads of stuff, so keep an eye out in the on the website, theurbanbirderworld.com, for our guests, which are going to be numbering in the hundreds by the end of the time we're finished. But until then, Professor Frank Rennie, thank you so much for spending an evening with us and showing us not only the knowledge you have regarding conchorates, but that splendid bookshelves, or the splendid bookshelves behind you, tons of books there. But thank you so much for your time. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.
And Zoomers, as ever, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm looking forward to some of your questions in the second bit in the Q&A. So if you're not a member, but until we meet again, hope to see you again real soon. But until we meet again, you know what to do. Keep looking up.